Hey, this is Kyle Carver from Strong Dads. Strong Dads wants to thank Crimer Beer House for sponsoring today's Strong Dads podcast. The beer house was started in 1982 by the Crimer family. Since that time, they've become a Cincinnati favorite. If you're looking for an incredible meal and an incredible setting, you have to try Crimer's Beer House down on Route 128 in Cleves, Ohio.
Hey, Strong Dads, this is Merle Hutchinson, and this week's show is really an interesting program from the sense of really testing your heart for being a father when you look or consider adoption, fostering, or even being just like in a big brother, big sister kind of program. And so I have a special guest on today, Dr. Roger Teller. And Roger and I had the opportunity to share back and forth our own stories. That's how our paths actually came together, because we had a very similar story and we had a common acquaintance that basically linked us up. And it was really good for us to have authentic, genuine conversation about the adoptive process, about what that looked like for both he and I. I think it's something that if any of you guys are out there considering this is a must listen to show. And if you know someone who's interested in maybe adoption or fostering or something like that, please have them listen to this show. Because we don't talk about all of the warm and fuzzies about adoption. We talk about adoption. We talk about how challenging it is, but how rewarding it can be. And how you have to get a different mindset, a longer term mindset. If you can't just live in the moment when you're in the adoptive process, because sometimes adoption in the moment can be pretty messy. And so I hope you guys enjoy the show. I thank Roger for his authenticity and his willingness to dig deep and share the story. Again, this is a message that we just want to get out there. And so hope you guys enjoy it. And like I said, if you or someone you know is in this mindset of thinking adoption, fostering, please share the show with them. Hopefully it can help them to make a decision that would benefit them and their family and this adoptive child. All right, so tune in and get out there and make it a great day. All right, today I'd like to welcome Roger Teller to the Strong Dads podcast. Roger, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Hutch, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Coming into that Christmas season, got a lot of relatives coming in. It's going to be cool. So we're really looking forward to getting everybody together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Roger, just to give everybody kind of a little bit of insight as to how this conversation started with between you and I, we have a common acquaintance. Actually, your brother-in-law is a friend of our family as well, and he knows our story, Linda and I's story with adopting children and having, of course, kids of our own and just going through that process. And he also knows our work with marriage and family and just how we think that that's a pretty big deal. And I think he kind of connected your way of life and everything with ours in terms of just how you guys operate. And that's really, he kind of linked us up together in thinking that you and I kind of had a common approach or thought about how we do family. So that's kind of what initiates our conversation.
Okay.
So how about let's start by you telling us a little bit about you, just so that our listeners can have some background, just where you come from, what you do, those kind of things, just so that they have a better rounded view of who they're listening to.
Okay. Well, I'm from Cincinnati originally, born and raised here till I was 8. When I was 8 years old, my dad got transferred up to northwest Indiana. So I actually grew up in Munster, Indiana.
Sure, I know where Munster's
about half hour south of Chicago. You know, most of my growing up was up there. I mean, I have 2 siblings, great parents. My father has since passed on, but I was very fortunate enough to get a good education and and went on to medical school at Indiana University, and then ultimately did a fellowship down at Vanderbilt. Late 1990s, was starting to look for a job, and was able to find a job in this area. So I came full circle, came back home in 1997, and I've been here ever since. So I live here in northern Kentucky. Met my wife through work. She was working at an office that we ended up, our group rented space from. So we met that way, and then ended up getting married in 2000, and then started having kids right away. My son Jack in 2001, my daughter Lucy in 2002. Followed that with a set of twins in 2008.
So you had 4 biological children.
Correct. Yep.
And so with the 4 children, and then moving in with the adoption. Now, again, we're not talking to a lady here, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you the question. I think you're about my age. How old are you?
57.
So I ask the age question because I can't speak for you, Roger, but I am finding myself parenting different on our younger kids just because of my age. I mean, the energy level is not quite what it was with my younger kids. My interest to do some of the things that they do is not there. So I have to dig a little deeper. So I just bring that up because you and I are not spring chickens when we jump into this next phase. So interesting to see how that weighs in on how you're parenting kind of in a later phase of life.
Right. And I was 36 when I got married. What's interesting is my wife's a lot younger. She's actually 15 years younger. I think a lot of people look at that a little funny, but it's kind of worked, well for us, I think. We're very different. I'm more quiet and shy, and she's more outgoing and boisterous. So it's worked out pretty well for us. But being older is it weighs into your decisions as far as how many kids you want to have. What's interesting is we had 4, and we realized after 4 that my wife, it was going to be risky for her to get pregnant again shortly after that.
Well, 4 is not exactly small by today's standards, so it's not too shabby.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so Roger, just from the perspective of Strong Dads, and just so you know a little bit about where we come from here at Strong Dads, obviously this is a ministry that is about pulling fathers back into the family, into the marriage, and hopefully doing our best we can to help the next generation of kids. And hopefully we see the benefits of doing that. Obviously, if we didn't believe that, we wouldn't be doing this. So from my perspective, I came from 20 years of working in elementary school, and it really got me to the point where I developed what I always refer to as my angry passion. And my angry passion was just me watching just great kids all of a sudden coming into dysfunctional families falling apart. And then way too often, I was seeing dads as the center of that problem. Dads leaving for some other reason, whether they were no longer interested, whether they just had something else going on the side. And again, that doesn't mean that all dads are the bad in this at all. I mean, there's equal responsibility. But I just felt like dads, by and large, were not being the leaders. And I saw the destruction that was coming out of that. And that's really what has motivated me to not jump on their case as much as to look at dads and say, hey, we need you. Man, don't do that. I need you to get back into the game. Your kids need you. Your family needs you. So what can we do to help dads get back into the game? So that's kind of my perspective here at Rock Solid Families and Strong Dads.
Mm-hmm.
So with that angry passion, it's funny how God works. My wife was always interested in adoption. I was not as nearly as motivated as she was. I never closed the door to the idea, but it would be her bringing up the conversation and entertaining it, and I would just kind of go, yeah, well, okay, we'll see. And, being in the elementary school, I got to see good adoptions and not so good adoptions. And so I kind of had a tainted view on that. But that sort of anger that I was starting to just generate in myself, mostly towards dads, bad dads, essentially was the root for me having to step up. And so what happened was, I always told my wife, if we're meant to adopt, I work in an elementary school, the good Lord will bring a kid or two or whatever right down our path. I mean, it'll be right in front of my face. So we don't really need to go out searching. I work in that arena. And so time passed and the adoption opportunity really never presented itself. And that was okay with me. I mean, I wasn't really looking for it. And so my wife became more and more quiet about it. And I got to a point where I was only 2 years away from being able to retire out of the school system. And, I'm looking at winding a career down, not firing things up. And wouldn't you know it, the good Lord brings 3 kiddos, their siblings, through my school building. And I see the situation that they're in. They'd been in and out of foster care for 5 years. And great kids, big-hearted kids. They seemed to, I just kind of gelled with them. And all of a sudden, the foster placement that was supposed to turn into an adoption fell through. And I found out that these kids were going to be split up and moved to 3 separate foster homes in order to hopefully get them out and be more capable of adoption. Just because of their age, they were hard to adopt kids. And when I heard that, I just thought, oh, okay, Merle, it's time to put your money where your mouth is. Here you are, talking about dads and stepping up. And so it's so funny how Linda was the one that always had it on her heart. It really wasn't so much on my heart, but it's so funny how God grabbed my heart, and Linda had no clue about any of this. Grabbed my heart with these 3 kids. And when I found out about the situation, and I went home and I said, "Hun, we need to talk." And I told her about the situation. Of course, her eyes just start welling up. And I'm like, well, we're not adopting yet, or anything like that. But, I'd like you to get to meet these kids. And that started the process. And so I always find it really interesting, never say never, because God will, he will grab your heart if you're not careful, and he will make amazing things happen. So that's really where our adoption process started. And so these 3 kiddos now have been in our house for 5 years. And So, Roger, you kind of hear a little bit of my story. How did this come about for you? Listen, you and I are not spring chickens, right? Like we said before. And all of a sudden, you're coming to a point where you're having to consider these adoptions. So work us through this process. How did you guys work through it? How did you get your mind and heart to align and to match up with your wife and start to make the process through the adoption?
Well, the way it really kind of started was, after we had 4 children, my wife knew that she was not going to get pregnant again, and I definitely didn't want to take that risk, and I was kind of done. But we felt extremely blessed and very lucky to have 4 children. Personally, I was kind of content with that, but my wife kind of still wanted to have a larger family. But we started thinking, well, maybe, God has blessed us so abundantly. Maybe we can help other kids out. And this was really, honestly, it was my wife's idea that we start, maybe kind of looking into foster parenting. And what prompted that was, her sister and my sister-in-law, her and her husband had been foster parenting for a while. So they were bringing, some new babies, home from the hospital, and they were living with her for a good while. And, she ended up having to, give up most of them, which was always hard. She was able to spend some really good time and bond with these kids. And that kind of appealed to us. And we had had a pretty good sized house and plenty of room and plenty of love to go around. So we just kind of thought that seemed like a good thing. And we started looking into it, and really kind of one thing led to the next. At the same time, I had one of my cousins. he and his wife had adopted a son from Haiti. That kind of seemed like a really cool thing. Not anything that I would want to do, but my wife, had other ideas. And when she started seeing that, we had another good friend of ours from around here in northern Kentucky. They were in the process of adopting a child from China, and my wife started doing some research, and one thing led to the next, and then we were having conversations about, what do you think about maybe adopting a baby from a foreign country? The more my wife looked into it, the more I think God was really kind of pulling at her heartstrings to do that. I was a little bit more reluctant to come around to the idea, but eventually I kind of felt the call as well. When you adopt internationally, there's a pretty good price tag that goes with that. So for me, that was a concern, because before I make any decision, I always want to make sure, I've done due diligence that this is all going to work out financially and it all makes sense and all that. My wife is goes by the emotional aspect of things, but it worked out. I mean, it was just, there was one obstacle after the next, but I think God just kind of worked everything out for us, and it just seemed like that was the path to go. So for us, it was really it was a journey of faith, nothing less. We went through the process, and one thing led to the next, and we ended up adopting an 18-month-old boy, Robel, from Ethiopia in 2012. So it was, and that was, so our twins at that point were 4 years old.
So, Roger, I want to go back a little bit, because you mentioned something that I think is really relevant to most of us men. You go through the thinking about this adoption process, and I really see two different ways of thinking. Your wife is emotionally triggered by this. She's excited about it. She can't think of a reason why not to do it. And so her heart is way out there, and that's really cool stuff. And oftentimes for us guys, our logic kind of gets in the way, and we start thinking about, well, are we going to be able to afford it? What's it going to look like for our family? We try to line up the nuts and bolts of this, and so I just find it interesting that God gives us these two different ways of approaching life, more from the logical and emotional sides, neither being right or wrong. It's just both being essential to how we're going about this. But ultimately, you come to a final decision of saying this is going to be a faith journey. And that's the part right there of resting in the idea of saying, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I'm going to have faith that it will. So I just think that that's really cool. That you and your wife kind of work together in that, but ultimately you both kind of threw your hands up to God and say, God, this one's on you. So I just want to point that out, because I see that working in my family, and for a lot of us guys out there, anybody listening to this show, that's going to be a real part of this, that ultimately it's going to come down to faith, because you have no clue how this is going to turn out. So pretty cool stuff there. So this also brings me to kind of another thought that I'll run by, and that is, once you decide to make this faith journey, you also start to really learn a whole lot more of what love is. We think oftentimes, especially in the English language, we use the word love so loosely and freely, and most of the time it seems to be associated with an emotion. And what you really start to find out when you're working through the adoptive process and taking in really kiddos that you don't know, and you don't know like who they are, how they operate, or anything like that, you find out really what love is. And I started to realize that love, more and more, it was going to have to be a choice. I started to understand that love is sacrificial, that love does not always mean like. And I think I bring this up because this is where the more we're in the adoptive process, the more we take off the rose-colored glasses and we do day-to-day life. And we'll be honest here, for all of our strong dads out there, it's not all a bed of roses. Adoption is hard, and it brings out a different type of love. And it's not a love that always feels good. It's a love of saying this is worth doing. This is the sacrifice is worth it. And so I point that out because I think our conversation is going to start to go down that road, because I really do want to be honest in our sharing of exactly what this process of adoption is like, because it's not a process that takes, a few days or months or, even a year and it's done. It just continues to be. It continues to be a growing process. So I bring that up, that this is really a condition of love that I was not quite ready for, or even probably understanding when we first started.
Well, I agree with you 100%. Love is definitely a choice. And it took me a while to figure that out. And it's not only a choice, but it takes a lot of work. And I think anybody that's been married can kind of appreciate that. The emotional love that you have early on, eventually that kind of fades. And then the more long-lasting love, that's something that takes a lot of give and take on both ends, and a lot of effort over time and a lot of work. I had mentioned this before when we were going through the adoption classes. There were a couple dads that got up there and talked, and this struck me, and I didn't buy it at first, but two different guys said, hey, this adoption's been great, but just the love that you feel for an adopted child is not the same as the love that you feel for your own biological children. And I could not at the time wrap my mind around that at all. And I didn't believe it. I told my wife, I said, I just don't buy that. I'm like, how do you go, to an orphanage or to some of these homes and, you see these kids and not just fall in love with them instantaneously. Once we adopted Robel, it hit me hard that the love that you have for your biological kids is, it's almost more innate. It's automatic. But when the child's not yours, it's something that has to happen over time, and it takes a lot of work. And I found that out the hard way, and I agree with you 100%. Our adoption journey, and we adopted twice, 3 children total, but 2 adoptions, been by far and away the hardest thing that I've ever done. And it's changed me ultimately for the better. But it's not been easy. And I'll tell anybody that wants to adopt, it's not a walk in the park. Appearances on the surface are always, there's a lot more going on there than you realize, even though you kind of look like this great family walking around. And in our case, we have white children, we have black children, and people think, oh God, that's so neat. You're such a blessed family, and you look so happy all the time. And I'm always thinking in the back of my mind, if you only knew, because it was a struggle for me when we adopted Robel. It was a real struggle because there was a huge difference between how Robel and my wife got along and how Robel and I got along. It took me a while to kind of understand it, but Robel's circumstance, and we found a lot of this out because we had the opportunity to actually meet his mom and spend about an hour through an interpreter, and got a lot of questions asked. So when she was pregnant with Robel and confronted Robel's dad about that, he was gone the next day. Robel, for the first 18 months of his life, really didn't have a father figure, and from what I understand, his mom had to work every day to support them. It was extreme poverty there in Ethiopia, and she got to a point where she would take him to work most of the time, and so he was with her constantly. And I got the feeling that there really wasn't much of a male presence in his life early on at all. When we get him to our home, he and my wife hit it off. They were able to bond a lot easier than he with me. He was always very reluctant, very cautious with me, and distrusting, I think, which to me, it rubbed me the wrong way, because you kind of have this sense of when you adopt, that there's that you're kind of owed something. You went out, you spent a lot of money on this, and you put a lot of time and effort into it, and you kind of feel like you're owed something. What I felt like I was owed was a little respect, at least to have a child that I could at least direct and communicate with, and a kid that would do what I'm asked. But that wasn't the case at all with Robel. So there was a big difference between my wife's interaction with him and my interaction. I found myself in a situation where it wasn't, okay, how can I eventually learn to love this kid? It was, how do I like this kid?
Mm-hmm.
Because to be perfectly honest with you, my wife would always tell me, she goes, what it's like, you've heard this through what we've learned. It's not easy, and the love takes a lot of work. And I said, I know that. And she would always say, well, you got to fake it till you make it. And she said, eventually that love will be there. And I'm like, and I would just think to myself, Heather, I can't even wrap my mind around love because I don't like this kid.
Mm-hmm.
For me, he was very difficult to like for a lot of different reasons. So it was a struggle. It was a real struggle. It's weird how time and patience and a lot of work eventually pays off, because we've got to the point now where he and I really have a pretty good relationship. So there's still those those memories, I think. So it's definitely a little different relationship than I have with my other kids, but it's a lot better than it used to be.
Roger, I just want to thank you for sharing that. I mean, that may not always come off right to a lot of people about the whole liking the kids, but that's just the reality of it. As I said earlier, liking and loving are two different things. And we have definitely found in our situation that it is hard because you don't always like what's going on. And there is a difference because these kids come from a background that you don't know about, genetics that you don't know about. They just have different personalities and characteristics, and sometimes you don't really understand those. And it makes it hard to like. And I think that is such the awakening of, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? And then learning how to love past that like phase. So I just thank you for sharing that. I think that's huge, and that's definitely something that our strong dads out there need to hear. You had also mentioned about maybe having an expectation, like you should get something from this as well. And man, I can relate to that. It's kind of like I could have a dog, and if every time I approach the dog, it growled at me, eventually I'm just not wanting to interact or be around that dog. And at the same time, if I have a dog and maybe he looks like a big old mean dog, but every time I walk around him, he wags his tail and runs up to me, it might be mean to everybody else, but shoot, he's giving me something, he's showing me some affection, he's showing me some attention. And that has been one of the struggles for us, just because in our home, our kids kind of reflect attention and affection differently back to us. And sometimes it's pretty absent. And, I'm just speaking here from my heart. It's my self-servingness says, hey, I could use a little bit more attention or affection from these kids, or maybe just a respect and appreciation, as if, I saved you or something and I should get something back. And the reality of it is you don't always get it back that way. And that was really, honestly, I have to say, it's challenging. It has been challenging. It's something that's forced a maturity that I've had to work through, a maturity in understanding what love is again. So, I appreciate very much you going down that road, and I think that's a very important lesson for any of our folks out there that would be interested in adoption or fostering, that you just have to wrap your head around that and understand that you may not get what you think you deserve in this process.
Right. And the reality is they really, particularly in our case with the younger kids, they don't know. They don't know what you've sacrificed, what you've given up, all the time and the energy. They don't know. All they know is that they had a life, as messed up as it was, a life that they were comfortable with, at least as comfortable as they could be. And now you've taken them away from that, taken them to a place where they can't communicate with anybody because they don't know the language. So they're completely all the people that they had in their life that provided them comfort and love are now gone. From their standpoint, and it's hard to kind of put yourself in their standpoint, they're scared. And I would be scared too. And, I definitely get that. And I could understand that when we first adopted Robel, luckily I had my wife to continue to remind me of that. She's like, look, he's 18 months old, and you're expecting him to understand things like he's an adult. But yeah, it's a challenge. And he ended up with, he was an ADHD kid. Mm-hmm. And we didn't, we look back on it now. I mean, it's so obvious to me, but we suspected that there was something going on with him, shortly after we brought him back, because his ADHD wasn't just a mild case. It was pretty severe. And I couldn't figure out, I was raising a son who was older, but I kept telling my wife, I'm like, man, this kid is just running me ragged. I said, Jack was never like that. I've never seen a kid that's just he can't sit still. He couldn't sit still. We couldn't get through a meal without him getting up numerous times. He wouldn't, once he was really talking and babbling, he wouldn't shut up. He couldn't stay focused on you, to try to teach him anything. His eyes would be darting all over the place. And so when I look back on that, it was all his ADHD. And it was really out of his control, but it just it made things really difficult for us as a family, and for me in particular, because my wife could calm him down, my wife could direct him, and he would listen to my wife. She could coddle him and all that stuff. I couldn't. He wouldn't listen to me. He was very I wouldn't say he wasn't afraid. He was just super cautious. I don't think he trusted me. And there were a lot of the first couple of years, there were a lot of outbursts and temper tantrums, and a lot of it was just him, getting used to trying to understand what was going on in his world, getting used to things, and it was kind of his way of lashing out and showing his frustration, and I get all that. With us, it got a little physical with my two daughters, because there was a lot of, we went through a lot of biting and scratching and hitting phases, and then a lot of destructive breaking things around our house, and particularly breaking my twins, a lot of their stuff on purpose out of frustration. And that's where I really, really had my struggles. I could deal with him and me, and he could hit me, bite me, whatever. And that's okay. I could kind of understand that. It would piss me off, but I'd understand it. But when he came to hurting my twins, it was a different story, because that would go right through me like nothing else. So it was tough. It was really tough there for a while, because I had a lot of problems controlling my own anger and frustrations over that. It would just send me to a different place. That it took a while to work through all that. But like you said, for me also, it took a lot of prayer. And I had actually gotten to a point where I would look at myself in the mirror, and I didn't like who I saw. I didn't like me. I didn't like the way I was living. I didn't like our whole family. My twins, who were 4 at the time, 4 and 5, they kept saying, why can't we send them back? And that would infuriate my wife, and she would just get so mad, and say, look, they're part, he's part of the family. You shouldn't say that, all that. And they knew how I felt about it. They could see my frustrations, and here I'm thinking, man, I'd love to send this kid back.
Yeah.
Honestly,
No, we're just being honest here, right?
Yeah. So, but eventually things, after a lot of prayer, things gradually started getting better. And once we got him diagnosed with the ADHD and got that under control, he was much more under control. And so things have clearly gotten better over time.
I think the whole process has been very humbling for me, just because, you may think it all about parenting, or you can be the dad that you think you can be and everything, and you realize you fall short. And, that's humbling. And you just think, gosh, I'm really messing up here. And that plays a lot of mind games with me in particular, like, what am I doing here? So I think that second guessing is something that, you have to be aware of. But I also think that's kind of the devil's workshop, that I can't allow that to go and become a runaway train on me. I have to pull that back in and do the work of, okay, I got to be the bigger guy. I can't always expect from these kids. They come about the world differently maybe than I do, and I'm in a leadership role, so I have to help lead them even when they're not always following the way I want them to follow. So some good points there. Yeah, Roger, you bring up something that I thought about, and I think it was one of the things that really put reservations on me wanting to even pursue adoption, and that was, what about our existing family? What about your biological kids? How is this going to impact them? They didn't necessarily ask for this, and I always had that concern of, what if we bring somebody into our home and it totally flips our home upside down? What's that going to do to our kids? So I really struggled with that. And, you kind of point that out, like, your little ones did not have a choice, and now they have somebody in their home that's being mean to them or whatever. And I would think that they would think, why'd you do this to us? You just kind of blew our whole family up. So that was a reservation that I had. And so it's interesting to hear how you guys kind of work through that. We ended up not adopting until our older boys were actually out of the house.
Yeah. That's exactly how they felt, and I agreed with that.
Right. Yeah.
I couldn't argue with them. I felt the same way. There was a lot of guilt too. There was a lot of frustration because I didn't like who I was becoming. I was became very impatient, very angry individual, but I also had a lot of guilt. I had a lot of guilt with our other kids because I felt like it was taking our time and energy away from them. And it wasn't fair. That wasn't fair to them. They didn't ask for this. We did this to them. So, that was a hard pill to swallow as well.
So, one of the things I think about in this whole process is, we've been talking about the difficulty, and by no means would I ever want to discourage a father from pursuing adoption or fostering. I would not want to discourage it. And instead, what I really want to do in this show and our conversation here is obviously point out the challenges that somebody's going to have, but also just the recognition for God in this process. I don't care how smart you are. I don't care how strong you are. I don't care how much money you have. When you actually are trying to be a father to these kids, this is a process that will break you down because you don't get it right. I'm just amazed at how much I screw it up on a regular basis. And I think this adoption process is something that in the long run has made me a better person. I'm not always a better dad. I screw that up, and that's what I think makes me have to fall back onto my knees and to be humbled. But I think one of the things that is really important for me is to have my mind and heart open to falling on my knees, to be humbled in that way, and to ask for help from God. And so, as you and I have talked through this process, the encouragement here is we're trying to, obviously we want dads to do the right thing from the get-go. We'd like fewer and fewer of these kids to be in these situations. And part of my work, with the kids that I'm with right now is the idea that I hope that when they have a family, that they are the dads that they need to be, that this, that maybe we've had the opportunity to stop the cycle that they came from, and that we can help dads be better in the next generation. But this whole process is one that you're just not going to get in a textbook. You're going to have to live it. You're going to have to walk it, and you're going to have to surrender. And so part of, I think, what the message might be to anybody out there listening is, don't shy away. But when you go in knowing that you don't know it all. Go in knowing that you're going to get rocked and that you're going to have challenges and that there's nobody going to always have the answer for you. And that sometimes you're just going to have to drop to your knees and say, Lord, help me. I don't know the answer. I don't know what direction to go. I don't even know what I'm doing. And by doing that, I think, I'll say, in our house, we've seen amazing things happen. And so that would be part of the message here that I think you and I are both sharing, that this is a very humbling process. What I want to go through it again, I know how much energy it's taken, but I'd never want to take it away from my life. It's been a huge process in my life that I think ultimately has made me a better person.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. Despite the tough times and the struggles that I had, I would recommend it to anybody. It's interesting, people always will come up to us and they'll say to Heather and I, when they see our whole family, gosh, you've been such a blessing to your adopted kids. And, the reality is, they've actually been more of a blessing to us. And people, they don't understand that. I'm with you. I agree with what you're saying 100%. This whole process for us it has definitely made me a better person. I know what it's like now to love the unlovable. And I'm not sure that without the struggle that I would have figured that out. I can honestly say I'm no longer an angry individual. I've learned that kind of to control my anger. I'm a much more patient father. I'm a much more tolerant father. And I think I'm a much more, loving father as a result of this. So despite the ups and downs, there's definitely more ups than downs. And I would recommend it to anybody. And it's interesting, we have neighbors that live right next door, and the father has one child from a previous marriage, and his current wife hasn't been married before, has no children, but they decided to foster parent, and they're foster parenting 3 children who in all likelihood are probably not going to get back with her mom. There's been a lot of problems there, but they lean on us for help and advice. Coming from my heart, I'm like, I think this is great, and I keep thinking I would love to see them eventually adopt these three beautiful children. I also say, look, it's not a walk in the park. It's not all roses. There's ups and downs and there's struggles, and please use us to help you through those tough times. And they do, and they have, and it's been good. It's great seeing other people go through that, because I can see the struggles, but I can see the joy too, because these kids bring them a lot of joy.
Well, Roger, as we get ready to wrap things up, I do want to thank you for your willingness to share this message. There's some things that we've shared that maybe took some people off guard, and they just thought, these guys are painting a darker picture of adoption, and that's not what we want to do. That's not what the goal is. The goal is to understand what this process is really like. And so I thank you for sharing your heart on that. My encouragement would be that if any one of you out there is considering this, to prayerfully consider it, to understand the heart that it takes, and then the conviction that it takes. This is not like something you buy from a store, and when you don't like it, you can return it. This is a person's life, and so the hard work is stuff that you just don't escape. And so I just want to pray that anybody out there listening and considering, you hear my story and Roger's story, and you think hard about what it is that you really want to do. It's not that there's not joy here. There is joy. In fact, that the joy is the longer term work through this, that you see the goodness that's coming through. But it's not always immediate. And so for that reason, really take the time to think about what you're doing, to pray, and to let God be part of that, to humble yourself sooner rather than later, that you certainly do not know it all, and you're going to need God's help to get through that. So that would be some of my send-off information there.
Yeah, and I've really learned that, God puts you in situations where he wants you. Although there were times that I doubted this, he only gives you what you can handle. He's going to take you out of your comfort zone because, he knows that that's how you're going to learn and how you're going to become a better person. This started off as a faith journey for us, and it's still a faith journey. And, both my wife and I have both become better people. And I think our family has become definitely stronger as a result of this. It started out of love. There were a lot of ups and downs and rocky roads. But I think, now with 7 children, I mean, we all have a lot of love for each other and a lot of love to go around. And I love hearing other people say, and I've seen this in my own family, hey, without your example, we wouldn't have gone to adopt, or, we wouldn't be considering international adoptions. It's nice when people reach out to us and say, hey, we're thinking about this. Obviously you've been through it. Tell us what it's like. And we do, we're honest with them.
Roger, do you have any final message that you would like to leave with our strong dads?
Just be patient with love, I think, all the way around. And I think most dads have figured that out with their spouses. Long-lasting love, I think, takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And so too, with children. Lean on God, keep praying. He'll make things work out the way they need to and the way they should.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, hey, I just want to thank you for your time and for your willingness to share the story. We also just want to be available for any dads or couples out there that are considering the adoptive or fostering process. Not that we're experts, but we do have a story and maybe some experience to share. So if there's anything that we can do to help any of you in that situation, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. In fact, you can reach us at rocksolidfamilies.org on our website, or you can give me a call at 812-576-7625. So again, I want to thank all of you listeners out there for helping spread our word, and I hope that our word is helpful to you. Please do us a favor and share the word, but also when you hear a podcast, give us a 5-star rating. That's just part of the process of us getting up higher on the search engines and getting that pushed out so that more and more people can hear these kinds of messages. Also, we would like to thank the Kramer Beer House for coming alongside of Strong Dads, along with Mansfield Insurance. So thanks to our sponsors there. So Roger, again, I want to thank you for your time.
I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to be on the show.
Hey, this is Merle Hutchinson from Strong Dads. Strong Dads wants to thank Mansfield Insurance Agency in Bright, Indiana for sponsoring today's Strong Dads podcast. Established in 1981, the Mansfield Insurance Agency has been dedicated to the individuals and businesses in Bright, Indiana, serving clients throughout Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky.